All right, I recorded this already, but it's like 14 minutes long, so I want to re-record it because I don't want it to be more than the 5-minute max. Promineo week 3, it was all about arrays in this week, and I believe they wanted us to use for loops more often than not. Unfortunately, well, I guess not unfortunately, but more fortunately, I decided to start using some of those array methods that are basically like loops. I will explain how they're different, or like how they're more useful at least a little cleaner to read. But it's a pretty long list, so as you can see, here's my JavaScript file. They asked us to programmatically, subtract the last element from the array from the first element of the array. You can do so thusly, actually, put a semicolon there. So basically, you take the array's length, you subtract 1 from it, and that gives you the last element in the array, and you can get the first element of the array by getting the index of 0 from that array. So I wrote a little subfunction here, and then I called it on ages here to print out the result that they requested. I then appended an element to that array, and then printed out the result of that appending, and then I ran the little subfunction that I read again. I wrote a for loop to run through the ages and then add them all together into an accumulator, and then divided by the ages.length to get the average of those, and then printed that average to the screen. We then had an array of names that we had to create a couple of functions for. And then after a while, I started with a for of loops like I did before, but then I shifted over into array methods because they're basically like loops. Of note, this one I just did the for of and had an accumulator again, except this time I was adding each individual person element. That's these 3. The length of those strings to the accumulator. I divided that accumulator by the total length of the names array to get the average, and that popped up that way. Then I started using array methods just to keep it a little simpler, a little cleaner, and to keep my file from getting absolutely massive with a bunch of for loops. The first one I used was the reduce method, so that I could get a singular string from all of the strings in the array. What the reduce method on an array does is it takes in a callback function, and then it takes in a couple things, but it takes in a callback function and an initial value. Those are the only 2 that are important here. You can see that callback function here, and the initial value here. It starts with an empty string. And what the callback function does is it takes in an accumulator, and it takes in each element of the array, each next element of the array. And what I've done here is I've returned on each iteration a string that includes the accumulator and then each next element included with a space. So what this will do is it'll actually print out a string with each word separated by a space. You could also do this with a .join method with the space in between each one. I would do something like names.join with a space like that. You can do that as well. It's perfectly acceptable. In fact, actually, now that I think about it, I just kind of went the hard way. And you could print that just with just as much utility. And then the next one is actually the map element. It's one of my favorite elements, actually, or one of my favorite array methods. I don't know why. Maybe I'm weird. But basically, what the map does is it takes in a callback function, and it actually returns to you a new array with elements in it that are essentially mapped from using the callback function on each element of the array that the map method was originally called on. So in this case, I take in each element of the names array, right? And I return element.length. And so this will make an array of the lengths of each string. I then use the reduce method again to get the total of the name's lengths. So that basically starts at 0, and then it adds to each accumulator, which starts at 0, the current value.length. And that's each name, the length of each name. And I print that to the console. I was asked to repeat the words. So each string method actually has a repeat method on it. So I just wrote a function that took in the word, it took in the number of times you wanted to repeat it, and it returns a string .repeat in, which is super easy. And I printed that to the console, and then I was asked to return a full name, which is just string interpolation, taking in both the first name and the last name, and returning a string here. Thusly, I continue to use the reduce method here, except one thing that I did in the return the sum of number of array, I need to rename that. This function is essentially supposed to return whether or not the sum of the number array is actually greater than 100. And so what I did was I ran a reduce method on the array that gets put into it, right? And this should start at 0. Yeah, that's good. And so what it's going to do is it's going to add them all together, starting at 0 with a 0 initial value, and then compare it to 100, see if it's whether or not it's greater than 100. And this whole comparison here gets returned from the function. It'll be false if it's not greater than 100, and it'll be true if it is. And I print out both examples here. And then my next job was to turn the average on an array. I did a very similar thing. I used the reduce function on the array that gets passed in to add all of the elements of the array together, and then I divided them all by the total length of the array that was passed, and I returned that entire calculation back from the function. And then I printed that out here in this console, and then I actually ended up using this same method in the next one, which was write a function that takes in 2 arrays and then compares whether or not length array of array 1 is actually greater than the average of array 2. I called that function that I wrote above here just because it was easier. On this, I wrote a comparison on the numbers that get returned, and I printed out both examples just to make sure that they were correct. The last one was write a function that returns whether or not you will buy a drink. You get a Boolean, which is it hot outside, and a amount of money in your pocket. And your job is to return true if you will buy a drink if it is both hot outside and you have enough money of $10.50. In there, I've printed out both of them. This operator will actually only return true if both values on each side that are true, and it'll return false in any other case. Finally, I was supposed to write a special function of my own making, which I decided to take in basically create a function that takes in an array of objects, and it actually filters that object or that array of objects based upon an ID that I do not want. So it basically loops over that array of objects, and then on each element, if the element ID is actually equal to the ID I do not want, then it returns false, and therefore it gets filtered out of the array. And I called that function here. And just to show you that it works, I can clear this and run node index.js. And as you can see, it is printing out all of the data that I promised you before. If you have any questions, give me a chat, message, I don't know.